Welcome to the Kiwimana Buzz.
Hi, welcome to the Kiwimana Buzz. This is episode 6 of our series from the NBA Varroa Resistance Conference, and this one is Paul Bolger. Paul Bolger is a senior policy analyst working for the Ministry of Primary Industries, and he's part of the New Zealand government. It's an interesting talk about all kinds of different things, about Varroa-resistant things, about honey importing from other countries, about the recent PSA outbreak in kiwi fruit. So yeah, sit back and have a listen. It's all good stuff, so I hope you enjoy it. If you want to check out our blog, it's kiwimana.co.nz. Thanks for listening, guys. See you later.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to introduce Paul Bolger. Many of you may know him. He is with the Ministry for Primary Industries, formerly MAF. He spent many years working in and around the beekeeping industry, so he knows many of you, and he knows a few things about bees. So Paul's going to give us a bit of an update on the government's thinking, around bees and Varroa. It won't take long.
I think the original thing on the internet describing these meetings said that I would talk about the government's position on bees. To the best of my knowledge, the government doesn't have a position on bees, so that leaves me with 44 and a half minutes left to fill. So I'll just talk about a few other things. Firstly, I'd like to do some thank yous. I'd like to thank the NBA, without whom we wouldn't be having this meeting. And this is 300 plus people, the biggest group of beekeepers I've seen gathered in one place for quite some time. Just out of curiosity, how many people here would describe themselves as hobby beekeepers, if you could raise your hand? Oh, excellent. We struggle to get hobby beekeepers to come to meetings, so it's nice to see so many. How many people here from outside the Waikato? Bloody hell. Is there anyone here from inside the Waikato? Right. Bloody hell. I don't quite know what to say. Interesting. The other party I should thank. No, I won't thank them actually, what the hell. I was introduced as being from the Ministry for Primary Industries, which most of you probably haven't heard of, but we were for many years before that MAF, and before that we were MAF with the MAF meaning something different, and for a while we were just MA, then I think before that we were the Department of Agriculture. According to the story, they were actually planning to describe us as the Department of Primary Industry, and somebody realised that they would make us dopey. They reconvened this focus group and came up with the Ministry of Primary Industry. That would have made us mopey. That was an improvement, but not quite there. And eventually they decided if they became the Ministry for Primary Industry, it would be pretty much hard to pin an acronym on it, so we're just MPI. It's the old MAF plus Food Safety Authority, which most people didn't realise was part of us to start with, so that's not a vast change, plus the Ministry of Fisheries, which means every time I step into the lift in the work in the morning, there's somebody in blue overalls with a tape measure and a torch demanding whether I've got any power to measure or not. What it means in terms of the beekeeping industry's interactions with the ministry, it's really a bit early to say. I suspect most of the stuff we've been doing we'll continue to keep doing, but there will be some changes of focus. Will that impact on beekeepers? I really haven't the slightest idea, and I don't think anyone else does either. There are, however, quite a number of areas in which the government comes into contact with bees and with beekeepers. And so I'll mention a few of those while I have the opportunity. For some of you who are particularly hobbyists, you're not involved in selling or trying to make money from honey. Some of this is going to be, by and large, irrelevant to you, so feel free to pay no attention whatsoever. I'm quite used to that from my audiences. For those of you, and I guess some of the things I cover may not be of particular interest to commercial beekeepers, so we'll just wander through the list. First of all, the other party that's brought us here today is a part of the Ministry for Primary Industries called the Sustainable Farming Fund. That's a small projects fund that's been running for a bit over a decade, and it issues grants or funds projects along with industry groups that are aimed at, and I looked them up on the website last night to make sure, that will improve the economic, social and environmental sustainability of the primary sector. They fund small research projects, demonstration projects, technology transfer, ways of adding value. And they've got two funds. There's a small project fund, or as we describe it, the even smaller project fund. That has grants of up to $25,000. The catch with all of this is you'll only get in matching funds. So if you're wanting to put an application in for this money, you need to have an equivalent amount of money to put in. Or sometimes value in kind is accepted. And for those who are currently working on projects, we warned the 2013 funding round applications open in August. That's next month of this year. The next fund is what was called the Large Project Fund. It's now called the Medium Project Fund, I believe. That goes up to $200,000 per year for up to 3 years. So, and that, I believe, is the category the bee breeding project that you'll be hearing about next came in under. Over the years, and the total value of the Sustainable Farming Fund is about $8 million per year. Unfortunately, they get probably to $40 to $50 million worth of applications, so most applications get turned down. The bee industry over the years has had a very strong track record of getting applications funded, and I think there's about 1.4 million of bee projects on the go at the moment, which is a pretty hefty total out of the $8 million a year we allocate. Additionally, and this is the one I really had to look up, there's a new thing, 4 or 5 years old, called Primary Growth Partnerships, and it's like the big brother of the Sustainable Farming Fund. And it's designed to fund research and innovation to boost growth and sustainability of the primary sector. And it started out at $30 million a year. It's been going up by 10 to 15 a year, so it's at $70 million now. And the minimum project they do is $500,000 from the government, $500,000 from the industry stakeholder. A problem for the bee sector is well, people say it's small. It's not all that small, but it's pretty bloody fragmented. So there's only been one primary growth partnership project funded in the bee industry, and that's involving Comvita and other parties, and it's looking at essentially the plantation growing of manuka, I understand. And it's a $1.7 million project running over 7 years. But there are opportunities for the bee industry there if the bee industry sort of is able to unite enough to grasp them and to put up its share of the money. So that's something for those of you, particularly at the commercial end of the sector, to think about when you're considering industry matters. Another thing probably on the go at the moment, which had a good thrashing at the NBA conference last month, is government industry agreements, and John Hartnell is on the industry negotiating team side of that, so he's one of the afternoon speakers and knows far more about it than me. I would just say that government industry agreements is a proposal to get industries to put money into surveillance and response for exotic pest and disease incursions. That's something that's currently entirely funded by the government. So the question we ask, there's not much in it for you guys, is there? Because the government's wanting you to pay for something it's currently providing for free. The carrot is that if an industry is putting in money, then it's going to have more say in the decisions that are made when a pest comes in or in how pests are monitored for. At the moment, and this is not something specific to the bee industry, it's across the whole primary sector. Australia's been running a version of this for a long time now, 10 plus years, and it's worked reasonably well there. At the moment, different industry sectors are looking at whether they should sign up to a memorandum of understanding, which will just mean MPI and the industry group will do a detailed examination of the costs and the benefits of it. And my personal view is, and most of what I'll be saying today is a personal view rather than a ministry view, the industry ought to sign up for that, because essentially all you're doing is agreeing to kick the tyres on it. It may be once you do a detailed analysis, there isn't actually significant benefit for the bee industry, but unless you do that analysis, you're never going to know. So to avoid stealing John Hartnell's thunder, I'll say no more on that, but it's something that the two industry organisations, the NBA and Fed Farmers Bee Industry Group are, and I think need to be heavily involved in. Something that may come, American foulbrood, it's our longest standing severe bee disease in New Zealand. It's been around since the 1880s when it killed over half the beehives in the country. It's been under legal control since the Apiaries Act 1906 was passed, I believe. Since 1998, it's been managed by the beekeeping industry under a national pest management strategy under the Biosecurity Act. Now, that was a 10-year strategy that started in 1998. Simple mathematics tells you it should have ended in 2008, but it didn't, because MAF, as it was then, realised it was about to expire and initiated a review. According to the Biosecurity Act, once a strategy is under review, it stays in force until a review is completed. We then sat down and had a cup of tea congratulating ourselves on a day's work well done, and the strategy has effectively been running on autopilot since then. I mean, its legal status has been preserved. The management agency, which is the NBA, has been running it, I think, pretty effectively since then, but it's on paper, it's been under review, and that has come to the attention of the minister and the minister before him, and I believe the minister before him as well. The current one pointed out that if we didn't review it soon, it would have been under review for longer than it had been technically enforced, that he didn't think that was necessarily a good idea. So you will be delighted, but probably surprised to learn that 7 minutes ago, were I in Wellington, I would have entered the minister's office with a group of other officials to discuss the recommendations on the review of the strategy. Hopefully he will rubber stamp that and sign a letter to the Parliamentary Council's office instructing them to start drafting up amendments to the strategy. After 4 years, after a very lengthy period of consideration, you could say, looks like the review is going to be completed. And realistically speaking, this is not going to make a great deal of difference to anyone. We're streamlining a few things where the management agency were having, found the current requirements were unworkable. Probably a good example would be currently if hives are found and the owner can't be identified, you're classified as abandoned hives. But before the management agency can destroy them, it's got to stick a notice on them for, I think, 28 days. And if they're not contacted at the end of that 28 days, then they've got to publicly advertise in the local newspaper. And if nobody responds to that after 28 days, then they can actually take some action. And quite frankly, it's too much of a pain in the arse. And to the best of our knowledge, nobody has ever responded to one of those newspaper advertisements. So we're simply removing that requirement. I think we're saying they have to make reasonable inquiry of the landowner and other nearby parties. If they can't find someone in about 7 days, they can just go in and do something about it. So there's a few things like that. There's a few things the industry would like. It would like a lot stronger enforcement powers, which the Biosecurity Act currently doesn't provide for. And this is Daniel coming to the front to tell me you can't hear a word I'm saying. No, it's a surprise. No, he's kidnapping a member of the audience who's looking desperately in danger of falling asleep. Take him out the back and force feed him some coffee and let him back in. A big complaint of beekeepers is lack of enforcement, and they complain to the management agency. The management agency complains to me. A significant issue is that the Biosecurity Act doesn't actually provide very strong enforcement powers for pest management strategies. There are on paper legal powers, but it's quite hard to line someone up and get them in front of a judge. They're independent of the review of the strategy. The Biosecurity Act itself has been reviewed, and there's a biosecurity law reform bill is currently before the House. That will be passed sometime later this year. And since the politicians haven't finished voting on it, we can't say exactly what it will do, but it will probably streamline the compliance process as well, which I think would be a very good outcome. That was probably AFB done, I think. So actually most of you won't notice any difference, but the legal status of the strategy will be I guess, amended somewhat, and the management agency will hopefully have a slightly more workable strategy to operate on. Given that foulbrood has been falling for the last few years, it's now 0.2 something percent, which is the lowest it's been probably since the 1880s. It's actually not doing too badly, but it could do better, and to do better it will require beekeepers to follow the legal responsibilities they have. Product registration, this is something that beekeepers don't think about very much, but every year lots of chemicals get registered. Most of them the beekeeping industry has no interest in. if they all of a sudden they need one to control varroa, suddenly that does become very interesting. People mostly take it for granted that a few months after we got varroa, we also got varroa treatments. I was talking to a beekeeper from, I think it was Chile, somewhere in South America, a few years back, and he said that 13 years after they got varroa, they still didn't have a legal treatment in the country. Of course, what that meant, they were just buying them up and somewhere across the border, Argentina, I suppose, and shipping them back. But we managed to get three synthetic products, three generic products, and a range of organics, all within about 2 to 3 years, which was an awful lot faster than most places did. And that was, I think, one of the reasons why the industry has grown very strongly despite the presence of varroa in New Zealand. It's interesting to note, when varroa came in, we had 300,000 beehives in New Zealand, give or take a few. We had 410,000 at the end of last month. So we've gained 110,000 since varroa arrived. It's more than a 25% increase in the size of the industry. In terms of beekeeper numbers, when varroa came in, we had about 5,000. They dropped. I mean, they dropped. And even in areas where varroa wasn't present, they dropped. I think it was just a general trend. Old beekeepers were dying and new ones weren't joining the industry. It bottomed out at about 2,500, so it halved perhaps 3 years ago, 3-4 years ago. It plateaued. We've now gained 1,000 beekeepers in the last 2 years, so we're up to just over 3,500 now. And I'm assuming some of the people in the room are in that group, which is great. What it means, though, is that the industry organisations, both the National Beekeepers Association, FEDS, and the bee clubs, have been in kind of a static mode for a long time. Everybody in there has already kept bees for a long time, and there's an awful lot of assumed knowledge. We've now got 1,000 people who in the industry. Some of them will have people who kept bees before and dropped out and have come back in, sure, but a lot will be new who don't understand what the requirements are around controlling American foul brood, don't understand some bits of fundamental beekeeping practice. So the industry will have to change its mindset a bit to make sure that knowledge is spread. And this is all useful industry good stuff, but we need to make sure that there's effective ways of communicating that to new industry entrants. Product registration. Mark Goulden mentioned the product Checkmite, which is an organophosphate. It's a reasonably toxic class of chemicals which, broadly speaking, New Zealand is trying to phase out of agricultural use. What that means is if the industry wants to use it, there's no guarantee that it will pass through the registration process. But I'd certainly second his view that Bayer, who own the rights to it, who developed it, are not going to put it forward again unless there's a strong expression of industry support. They put it forward 3 years ago, perhaps 4, and Irma, as it was then, rejected it because the industry didn't want it, thought it posed too many risks. Irma said, we're prepared to take a look at it again if the industry thinks there's a need. So I think that is something the industry needs to think about. And if you're going to go down the track of using it, you're far better to use it now when Amitraz still works and your synthetic pyrethroids sometimes work, rather than flog the synthetic pyrethroids, that's Apistan and Baverol to death, flog Apivar to death, that's Amitraz, and when they're completely stuffed, then go to your third chemical, because that means you've got no rotation. If you're going to go there now when you can then rotate between Checkmite, Apivar, and maybe Apistan and Baverol if they're still working in your area. So you're using them and losing them one at a time is the way the rest of the world has gone. You'd like to think we could learn something from that. But that's something the industry has to think about. Top bar hives, why don't I mention them? Because I get more letters from beekeepers about top bar hives than I believe every other topic combined. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, most beehives are kept in a box, wooden frames, or nowadays sometimes plastic ones, a Langstroth pattern hive. That's kind of how it's been since the 1850s, when the Langstroth hive was invented, and that's kind of how we assumed it would always be. In recent years, some hobby beekeepers in particular have started keeping bees in a different pattern of hive called a top bar, which is typically a semicircle, or as close as your carpentry will allow you to get to a semicircle shaped hive. The bars are typically just a piece of wood, often with a bit of foundation underneath, sometimes not. The bees theoretically, well, it mimics a natural hive. They have advantages. They're cheap and relatively easily constructed. They're simple. They're light because you don't super them upwards as you do with a conventional hive. You don't have to lift off 50 kilos of honey to look at the queen. And all of those things make them attractive. The downside is that there probably is, well, not probably, there is a much greater likelihood of the bees attaching the frames to the outside of the box or to the other frames, and thus making it very difficult to inspect. Back in the 90s, when these were little known, occasionally when I was an apiary officer in Auckland, I'd come across one. There was one guy who kept one for decades up there, and it was a pleasure to inspect. It wasn't any harder to inspect than a conventional hive. A few others I noticed, people came in, set them up, and then 2 years later, what I found was they made an excellent herb planter. All the frames would get glued together, become a nightmare to try and lever them out. The person who started off in a rush of enthusiasm would get stung up badly, get nervous about them, and then either let the bees die out or even kill them out and go into something a bit safer like chives and rosemary. It seems to have become a big political issue in the industry, with commercial beekeepers demanding they be banned forthwith and hobby beekeepers resolutely defending their right to keep them. People keep asking, what is the government position? And as usual, we don't have one. But my general thing is to go back to first principles. Why are we requiring people, as the law currently does, to keep bees in a movable frame hive? And the big question is a top bar hive a movable frame hive? Well, it's movable, but it doesn't really have a frame, so you can argue that either way. I think the NBA's lawyer thinks they don't comply with the current rules. I would hate to be the person arguing that in front of a judge, because it could go either way. My view is the whole reason for having that requirement is you can move the frames. If you can take them out and inspect them for disease, I really don't care what they look like. And if people want to build their own hives to whatever bizarre shape they fancy, I kind of don't really think it's my job or the government's job to stop them, as long as they're not posing a disease risk. And I think they pose a disease risk when the hives are in such a shape or configuration you can't examine them for disease. And if that's the case, then I guess they're not meeting their legal requirements. We'll try and tidy this wording up a bit in the review of the pest management strategy, but my inclination is to stress the fact that the frames have to be removable, frames containing combs, however you define frame, and not focus too much on what they're supposed to look like, but rather focus on the need for them to be inspectable. It's an area that seems to have generated far more heat than light, and to me it is actually, it's a bit painful to say it, but it's an example of where the industry can put a lot of energy and time into something that's probably not all that important, where the fact that miticide-resistant varroa looming down on you like an out-of-control bulldozer is probably something that people ought to be writing to me about, but aren't. Product registration, top bars. Honey imports. We currently don't have very many honey imports. There's a string of Pacific islands which are allowed to ship honey to New Zealand because they have the same disease status as New Zealand, mostly because they got their bees from New Zealand. We don't get large volumes of honey from those islands. Last time I was aware, Pitcairn only had 8 hives, and to get the honey to New Zealand, they've got to basically row it out to a passing ocean liner, have it winched aboard, and then delivered to Auckland about 3 weeks later. So they're not exactly dominating supermarket shelf space. Niue is the only one that has a serious commercial beekeeping operation. There's an ex-Waikato commercial beekeeper running maybe close to 1,000 hives, 600 to 1,000 hives up there and shipping the honey down quite successfully. However, many years ago, in the mid-90s I think, Australian government has been pressing for a long time, not as long as we were with apples, but for a long time, to get their honey into New Zealand. They've never been able to do that because they have a disease called European foul brood, and we don't. And that is a bacterial disease, not particularly related to American foul brood, that can be transmitted in honey. However, data that was generated in the early 2000s demonstrated, I think, certainly to our satisfaction, that if you heat treat the honey for long enough, you may lose a bit of flavour and gain a bit of colour, but you will kill the European foul brood. So on those grounds, MAF worked on an import health standard for Australian honey. Now, that triggered off a long round of court battles between the industry and MAF, as it was then. I think we won the first round, industry won the second round, government changed the law to clarify something, and then an independent review panel was appointed, which made an exceedingly long list of recommendations. But the key things they recommended was that they accepted that the heat treatment would kill the European foul brood, but there were 3 other diseases they didn't think MAF had considered carefully enough in the developing the import health standard. They were, respectively, Painobacillus alveoli, which is a close relation of American foul brood, Nosema cerani, which is a sort of nosema, closely related to the nosema we've always had, and a bee virus, Israeli acute paralysis virus, which is closely related to Kashmir bee virus. Now, what essentially they said, we have to figure out whether they're here or not, and if not, whether the heat treatment's going to kill them. So we went out and looked, and at first glance we found pretty much Painobacillus alveoli and Nosema cerani, but we couldn't find, and did a nationwide survey without finding, Israeli acute paralysis virus. So the first 2, when considering imports of honey from somewhere else, is of no consideration. We've got it here, and therefore it's not something we should be weighing up when making import decisions. For Israeli acute paralysis virus, we appear to not have it. We've got something very, very similar, but something not exactly the same. So MAF then contracted a lab in the UK to look at whether heat treatment would kill Israeli acute paralysis virus in honey. That work is supposed to be complete at the end of this year. It was also supposed to be complete at the end of last year, so I'm not actually anticipating an end to that anytime soon. But should that work be completed and with a satisfactory conclusion, then MAF will be MPI will be in a position, to issue an import health standard for Australian honey. Now that is entirely possible to trigger another round of legal battles, but we will see. What that means, though, I think, is the industry ought to be aware of this. Nobody's thought of this for 2 years. Nobody's written to me about it for 2 years, and I would kind of hate to think the first thing you realise is when you walk into your supermarket, or when you get a call from the supermarket and say, sorry, we don't need your product anymore. The fundamental dynamic is that Australian honey is quite a lot cheaper than New Zealand honey. I don't know by how much, I'd guess by at least a third at present. It's also, I think it's fair to say, not particularly nice in many cases. It's eucalypt derived. Australians have been reared on it and they're used to it and like it. But to me it tastes, a lot of it, obviously there's thousands of sorts of honey coming out of Australia just as they're here. A lot of it tastes a wee bit like cough medicine, or it's got that distinct eucalypty tang to it. And whether the New Zealand consumers will take to it, I don't know. But if the price is right, they'll sell some product. So the New Zealand industry needs to be aware that this issue hasn't gone away. Work is being done on it, and it will reappear at some time in the future. Somebody bailed me up at the NBA conference a month ago, saying they thought that we hadn't really found Nosema cerani. It was just MAF was, I think, conspiring with the Australian government to fool everybody into thinking we had it, to let the honey come in at the behest of supermarket chains. Or I lost track of exactly who was involved. But a group of Waikato beekeepers, I think, last year or the year before last year, challenged the identification and demanded that we sent samples to international labs. We sent samples to a lab run by Ingmar Friis in Sweden, who's I would regard as maybe Europe's best researcher on Nosema cerani. And we sent another batch of the same samples to Jeff Pettis at the USDA in Maryland, and they both found pretty much exactly what we found. We've got Nosema cerani. If anybody's been trying to bend your ear that we don't have it, either the conspiracy involves an awful lot more people than they imagine, or we really, really have got it. So for the commercial beekeepers, this is something you need to think about. And it's an interesting question to ask. What would happen if a whole lot of cheap Aussie honey turned up on the wharf tomorrow, and legally? My guess, and I'm not a honey marketer, my guess is it would, in a flash, displace the bottom end of the New Zealand product. All of the PAMs, budget brandy stuff which sells on price, they could get something cheaper and they would. So what that would mean is the beekeepers currently supplying that part of the market are going to have to find something else to do with their honey. Currently, that would mean it going overseas. So that would not necessarily be a bad thing, given broadly people are making more money out of exports than the local market at present anyway. Daniel, how am I for time? Excellent. Excellent. Market access. A lot of, again for the commercial guys, a lot of issues that the industry is grappling with now revolve around getting our product into overseas markets. This is not new markets, this is markets we've always had. Unfortunately, as lab technology around the world has improved, they can find more and more stuff, more and more cheaply, and they are. So, honey from Viper's bugloss, which some of you know as blue borage, a lovely blue flower that blossoms throughout the Canterbury High Country, or the South Island High Country. It's also common in up the east coast of the North Island, increasingly common. That contains something called pyrrolidazine alkaloids, which 5 years ago nobody knew about, but now the EU is convinced is going to poison all their children in their beds. So we're having to commission a big research, or the industry is having to do a hell of a lot of expensive research to try and retain its access to the European market. There was a story some of you may have saw in the Herald, I think last week, about sugar in honey. There's a test widely used, C3, C4 sugar test, to determine whether people have been adding cane sugar to their honey, which is not unknown in some parts of the world. The bad news is a whole lot of New Zealand honey has, in the last year or two, suddenly started triggering this test. It's coming up as being part cane sugar. Now, we don't think it is part cane sugar, and it turns out, well, scientists at GNS believes that the test is fundamentally flawed. If honey has high protein levels, which is generally associated with Manuka honey, or high pollen levels, because pollen contains protein, it will trigger a false result, indicating that there's sugar there when there really isn't. So there's another urgent project underway to try and get a new, I guess a modified version of the test developed, and once it's developed, it's going to have to be try and get it introduced internationally as the replacement standard. That's expensive. It had to be done at short notice, and the party the government's been working with mostly has been the Bee Product Standards Council, which has, I think, done an excellent job. It's a small and not particularly well-known group containing members from the NBA, Feds, and the Honeypackers Association. And the story that was in the Herald last week was kind of neutral. It was saying, yes, there's a problem with this test, and people are working on it, and that was really it. That was how I read it. But when we first got the questions from the journalists, as the industry people here are involved, and there's a few of them, I would know it was clearly going to be a beat-up. It was New Zealand beekeepers are adding sugar to their honey, and it's getting rejected by overseas markets, shipped back to New Zealand, sold to unsuspecting Kiwis. The government's not doing a bloody thing about it. It was clearly a beat-up story, and we had to work very fast and very hard to get the messages out there that was sort of setting out what was really going on. There's a test problem. Allied to that, there may be an issue with people feeding sugar to their bees too late in the season, particularly pollination hives come straight out of pollination, straight onto a honey flow. Some of that sugar could come through, and there may be some need to change practices in the industry. And there's a lot of areas like that where the government and the bee industry don't necessarily have a conflict. There are areas where we do, but there is a need for the two parties to work closely together. Final point probably, industry structures. Currently we've got two national representative bodies, Fed Farmers Bee Industry Group, NBA. You could argue it's not ideal. I think the government will work with whoever it has to work with. But I think the industry more broadly needs to take a look at itself and work out what things it wants to be doing in future and how it's best to do them. A lot of people say, pointing to the NBA, certainly this was said to me a few times at the conference last month, the NBA's 100 years old next year. It's going strong, and it's something to be very proud of. It's done the industry extremely well for a long time. I just point out that 5 years ago, my grandmother was 100 years old, and she was still going really strong too. Now she's dead and buried. Simply being old does not necessarily mean you're immortal, or you don't have to be vulnerable. You're not susceptible to change. A big thing, a theme I think, linking some of the things I've talked about, from the research thing I talked at the front, that's partly paid for us to be here today, is that this government and any future government, before it puts money into an industry, it's going to want money. It's going to want the industry to cough up some money on its own. And that's, people complain, but I actually think that's perfectly reasonable. There are thousands of people out there wanting the government to do something. The way to work out who's serious is to ask them to put some of their own money on the table. And this is not going to go away with the change of government. It's not going to go away with time. If there's stuff the industry wants done, it needs to think of a way of funding that. At the moment, this basically involves the heads of those two industry groups frantically ringing around their members and metaphorically passing around the hat and trying to secure funding on an ad hoc basis. That's kind of okay once or twice, but you can't run a whole industry sector like that. You can't, an industry that's shipping out allegedly $100 million worth of exported product a year, plus a domestic market, plus a pollination industry, has got to look at organising itself so it can fund important projects more readily than it does now. And Daniel's giving me the nervous look. I will conclude there. This wasn't nearly as funny as the talk I gave in Christchurch, but it probably had a lot more useful things in it. I would thank again the MBA for inviting me here, for the Sustainable Farming Fund for making them invite me here. I'm very impressed. I work surrounded by economists at the moment who tell me there's no free lunch. It looks like we've just proved them wrong. In fact, getting free lunch for 300 beekeepers is, I would say, close to the biggest miracle since Jesus did his trick with the loaves and the fishes. That's about how often a free meal comes along in my line of work. You don't know how many minutes I've got for questions, but I'm happy to take one or two if Daniel will let me. Otherwise, I'll be on the panel. Never listens.
I just want to ask a question about some subsidies for varroa treatment. Is there any sort of planning or will be, because it seems like it's a problem in the government and we would like to treat them, but it's probably quite expensive for, especially probably for amateur beekeepers. We are trying our best to just sort of keep the cost down and have these hives as created by ourselves, but what about to treat them? So, can we have some?
Question is there likely to be any subsidies on varroa treatments or treatment methods? And I have to say that, quite frankly, the answer is no, not a hope in hell. I'm sorry, that's blunt, but it's perfectly true. The government's not giving out money on pretty much anything at the moment. That's just the way it is.
Paul, I trust you're here representing the government, and when the results come back, if they seem to be allowing honey into New Zealand, could you give me a promise that you'll have to do a review on it and take the same length of time as a review on the National Pest Management Strategy?
Due to the vast efficiency gains from the recent restructuring, I can't give that promise. I would estimate you're looking at least 6 months from the receipt of those results, which are themselves, I would guess, at least 6 months away. But I can't be certain as to those timeframes. I mean, it was going to be 6 months a year ago to get the results. Whether they're going to go any faster this year than last year, I have no idea. But you probably should be aware that, as my understanding is, the difficulty with this virus is not killing it. It's getting it out of the bee and into the jar of honey alive, so then you can try and kill it. So you've got to say, if it's that fragile that you can't extract it from the bee without it dying, the prospect of giving it, is it 65 degrees for 2 hours or something, my picking its chances of survival are not particularly high.
Okay. Paul, given that we're moving towards maybe perhaps eliminating AFB or reducing it to very low levels, if you start allowing Australian imports in, even though the disease exists here, isn't there a potential to increase the incidence of AFB, since I don't think Australian beekeepers have the same restrictions as we do? And also, is that a level playing field as well then?
It's a good question. I didn't quite get the final bit, but essentially, would letting in Australian honey undermine the foul brood control program we have, given the foul brood control programs in Australia aren't really comparable? It's an interesting one that I don't have a really clear answer to. I think commercially packed honey is a pretty minor source of foul brood infection, but possibly not a zero one from discarded containers. I think you'd have to consider whether you'd put a upper limit on spores allowable or something like that. But that is one of the many issues that would have to be worked through if the Israeli acute paralysis virus question is solved. Another one would be traceback systems to ensure that you were actually getting Australian honey, given that Australia imports honey pretty widely. So you'd need to have a system for verifying it back to its apiary of origin and confirming that it had received the appropriate degree of heat treatment. None of that stuff is impossible because we do it for lots of other products, but it's stuff that would all take time to sort out. Yeah, it's a good question.
Paul, I got a question about how have it on Earth been possible to have pollen imported from wherever, Italy or wherever, China. How has it ever been possible that we have not been known that?
Essentially because it was coming in under a plant import health standard, and a standard I think that was designed for breeding material, and it's probably pollen that's not been in contact with bees. It's supposed to be milled from closed flowers. As a vector for bee disease, I'd say your risk is very, very close to being zero, but obviously as a risk for plant disease, considerably higher than zero as it's turned out.
Are there any more questions for the man from the government who's here to help you? There's one over there. Is that Mr. Hartnell?
Hang on, I think he's the next speaker.
Just can I go back to the Australian honey issue? And I'm just looking back, it's been going on for a long time now. In that time, Australia have changed their policy on honey, and they're now net importers of product from China and from Argentina, and that's going into the packs that they're selling both internationally and domestically. My concern is that, A, it's not Australian honey, but under CER, 50% content suddenly puts it as Australian honey. So I just wonder how that's going to play out in due course.
Well, the CER content rules don't, to the best of my knowledge, apply to agricultural products. They're certainly not relevant from a biosecurity point of view. So the only import health standard we've looked at is for Australian honey, Australian honey. The point about there being more imported honey around in Australia now than there used to be is a valid one, so we would need verification systems. But it also does raise the question of how much cheap honey have they got to sell us? Probably less than they used to have.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to let you go now, mate, and ask Michelle Taylor from Plant and Food if she'll take over.
Thank you.